Now that's different. And they'll say, see, I think that's actually charged. You gotta look at me in the eye. So she goes, that's true. And that's why in that one word, it's not like, oh, she'll be finished. 3 weeks and 3 days. Okay, we're getting through this stuff. I don't want to be on it anymore. She's getting lost.
All right, good evening, everybody. Glad to see everybody this evening. We do have some who are sick this evening, but we will talk about them a little bit later on in a good way. We're not going to talk about them, but we'll mention them a little later. We'll go ahead and begin with a word of prayer from Brother Lum here in a second. If you want to go ahead and open your Bible to John chapter 2. John chapter 2, we'll begin there this evening for our Bible class. Okay. Oh, okay. That's fine.
Father, we thank you for today. Once again, we have the opportunity to together again, open your word and discuss it. We thank you, Father, that we have this freedom to do so. We thank you, Father, for the purity of the word, and the purity of life that Christ shows us. And He lived on earth, and He is here to show us the way of living Christian life. We thank you, Father, for this love us down on the cross, so we have the opportunity to serve you. Pray, Father, we can serve you each day, not only when we meet as a congregation, but be a traveler in everyday life as well. We pray, Father, that always be a good example, and always reach out to those who need help, and help teach them the true word, so that they will obey the gospel and be saved in the Christian life as well. Do it, those, Father, that are sick. We especially want to remember our sister Betty, and heart problems. We pray for her, Father, that doctors will do the things they need to do to relieve heart problems, and we pray, Father, that this thing will be successful and that she can return to everyday walk of life. We pray, Father, you be with those others that are sick. Brother David, he had some issues with his health. We also pray, Father, for Mary, and she has things before her that be fixed as well. We pray, Father, for success for that. And we pray, Father, for those that are undergoing a lot of daily problems, with these illnesses, and we know what their hearts are eager and helping hand. We pray, Father, for us as a congregation that we remain faithful to help this way. Christ, we pray.
Amen. Okay, so again, we're starting in John chapter 2. This is going to be the last night that we do our Q&A stuff. We're already 3 weeks into this, and we've already forgotten parts of 1 Corinthians. So we're going to begin on the second half of the discussion on elders, wine, deacons. And we stopped in John chapter 2. We didn't really get through the context very much. But when you look at John chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, we read about the first miraculous occasion in the life of Christ. At least that's what the text would tell us. It would say in verse 1, on the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding, and they ran out of wine. The mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now, and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. When the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. And he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, when we look at this text, people tend to use John 2 as an advocate for saying, well, we can drink alcoholic beverage. But there's a few things in the text that don't make sense. Number one, we're talking about Jesus. He was sinless, which would also mean that in view of Jesus' character, he would never do anything that would cause anyone to sin. So for someone to say social drinking parties would be okay, we'll look at 1 Peter 4 and it'll tell us quite clearly that is a sin. You cannot do that. In fact, putting a stumbling block in front of people under the old law and the new law are both sins. Since we're looking at the life of Christ, we're mainly looking at the new law. If Jesus had put a stumbling block in front of the way of these people, then that would make him imperfect. That would make him sinning. Now, textually, when we look at the text, number one, they ran out of wine, but does this tell us what kind of wine? I think that's more of begging the question if we make an immediate assumption. This is alcoholic or this is non-alcoholic. The text doesn't tell us, but there are some implications. In fact, if you notice in verse number 6, there were 6 pots already consumed. And in fact, the word that's used in verse number 10, after the people have well drunk, that word in Greek means to make one drunken or one who is drunk. So if you're drunk, your taste inhibitions are gone. You wouldn't be able to taste anything, let alone if it's something different. You have to try really, really hard to get your senses to work the way that they ought to. Jesus went ahead, based off the measurements that are, or really the amounts that are given here. Verse number 6, 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of the purification of Jews, 20 or 30 gallons apiece. We're looking at 120 to 180 gallons of wine. If we want to call that alcoholic wine, these people would be out of their minds. I don't think this man would have spoken clearly, unless you want to read verse 10, every man at the beginning says, a good wine. It doesn't say that. This was a very clear-speeched individual. Otherwise, it would say he slurred his speech, and the words wouldn't quite be as clear as they are. So the evidence would show these people had already drunken all of this, or drank all of the liquid. There's so much liquid that it uses the same word it would use for drunkards, meaning well drunk. And there's no sign of intoxication from this, but rather we do find whatever kind of drink this particular wine is normal custom for Jewish feast. In fact, noticing these are also Jews that are here in this occasion, it would be a violation if you have someone presenting an alcoholic beverage in which if you had any priest there, it was against the law for them to drink alcoholic beverage. And if they did drink alcoholic beverage, they were to die because of it, because it violated the law. So what can we say textually? Well, you've got to make a really strong argument whether it's alcoholic or non-alcoholic, but when you see exactly what they did, and the man, at least the main master of this, he still had the ability to drink or taste things. I have a hard time saying. Oh, I don't know how many people. I just know in the well, when it said in view of the marriage feast that it was all gone. So however many it would take in order for all this to be gone, I don't know. I don't know. That's true. That's true. That's true. So you could also have a violation of a sin of gluttony here in view of drinking amounts. Now, we said just briefly beforehand, if this had been alcoholic, let's consider the character of Christ. Yes?
So I'm just trying to understand. So are you saying that the wine that they drank at first was, you're saying, well, are you saying that you think that it was alcoholic or was not?
Well, the word that's used here by the master of the feast, they had well drunk. In the Greek, that's literally what methisko means, to make drunk or to become intoxicated, which if it was the case, you have Jesus feeding the bad habits of these people, which would be a sin under the old law. That violates Proverbs 24, verse 11. I'm saying if we're saying this is alcoholic or if this is not alcoholic.
I mean, the one before I'm saying, so at the feast, what they were giving, you're proposing that the first thing that they drank all six of was not, is what your opinion is.
As far as I know, for both of these, if we're talking about like hard lemonade or like a Bud Light or a Coors Light, that's not what's under consideration. We're looking at first century, so we're looking at some kind of great beverage of sorts. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called wine. I can't tell from the text specifically if someone says this has to be alcoholic. I've got words that tell me this was not alcoholic if they could still taste, because you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a different kind of drink after you've already well drunk, which implies they've already become intoxicated if it's a highly alcoholic beverage or just alcoholic at all if they've well drunk.
My thought was that when I read this was that probably he didn't make alcoholic wine because it says the good wine, which when I understand that's the first wine, that's when they first make it, and it's only available at a certain time of year.
Absolutely.
So in other words, I don't know what time of year this is, but it'd be more of a miracle if he created this good wine that's past that time of year, because there would not be any non-fermented or non-alcoholic beverage. So I thought that, in my opinion, when I looked at it, I was saying that they probably had alcoholic or whatever, normal whatever is there at first, but this was the good wine or the wine that was fresh, which would be even more of a miracle because nobody could make it. It's not available.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So yes. So here's another good question, and for people who would advocate this is alcoholic or non-alcoholic, where did they get their wine from, the first batch? Well, no. Like, where? Where exactly did they get it? But which vineyard? The text doesn't tell me. In fact, I don't know if this is like brand spanking new, fresh out of the I don't want to call it distillery, fresh out of the wine press, or if this is a few days. It doesn't tell us that in the text, but yeah, that's true too. It doesn't really tell us the time of the year. So there's a lot of things the text does not tell us that a lot of people pre-assume going into this text, which creates more problems. Now, it is true in view of the Old Testament, and even in first century text, every time we talk about good wine, we're talking about literal just grape juice. It's just pure grape juice. Not much sugar. It's just pure grapes, or the blood of the grapes, as Isaiah would call it, and they called that new or good wine, or new wine, that which is new in the cluster in and of itself. So
maybe that's why they went on drunk 120 gallons. They didn't want it fermented.
that's, well, it could be that too, because it's not every day you have that going. But just like someone had just mentioned, well, no, Philip, you had just mentioned it. How many people were there? I don't know, but it was enough to drink all the first batch.
Well, 7,680 ounces is 60 gallons. That's from old and new. Now, we probably drank 20 ounces. Now, if we drank 20 ounces, I don't know how much they drank, but that's 384 people. At 20 ounces wine or grape juice or whatever.
Oh, if you say that, everybody's stuck to their max.
20 ounces, that'd be 384. If they drink 40 ounces, that's going to be half of that. Half of 384 is
Half of 84?
384.
Oh, 384.
Anyway, whatever that is.
82.
That. Let's go with that.
And if there were children and stuff that would be less for them and more for something else. So you don't know how many ounces there were. There had to be, I think, a bunch of people there. I think it was a big event.
Man.
Big wedding or a small wedding?
Yeah, I don't know. Yes, that's what it leads to. So when people start to turn John 2 more into an example of advocating drinking alcoholic beverage versus non-alcoholic. Jim, I like what you just said. They wouldn't remember this. What in the world? They're missing the point of this text. This text is emphasizing, as it says in verse 11, this is the beginning of the manifestation of the glory of Christ. To start looking into this and using this as a isolated text to make some kind of point, there's a lot of gaps they've got to fill in, that the answers are simply not there. Looking in view of Christ's character, something about this beverage, whatever it was, James chapter 1 verse 13 would still have to apply to Christ. When man says that he's tempted of God, that's not the case. God cannot be tempted with evil, neither does he tempt any man with evil. That's not what Jesus does. In fact, as we already mentioned, 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 3, I want you to look at that text, and there are three specific terms that are used that talked about a restriction against a massive group of people and intoxicating them. And whether or not you want to put that into a group of people or into an isolated event, you would need to look. I think the first one would deal more with the individual, but the second two would definitely deal with large groups. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse number 11. Verse number 3. Actually, let's begin in verse 1. There's some words to point out. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind, for he who had suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. No sin involved. That he should no longer live the rest of his life or his time in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. For we have spent enough of our lifetime doing the will of the Gentiles when we walked in, notice these, lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regards to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Now, when I look at this, drunkenness can deal either with an individual or we're talking about a group of people. Drunkenness is more of an individual issue. You're clearly intoxicated. Revelries is the same word that's used in Galatians 5:21, talking about the works of the flesh, that speak of festive celebration drinking. Does a marriage fall in that type of celebration? Sometimes, yes, it can fall into that category. And then it has drinking parties. It's not a good marriage unless there's alcohol involved. Well, all three of these, Peter is saying this violates, if you notice in the beginning of verse number 3, it would talk about we spent enough of our past lifetime. That's who you were. That's not who you are. And he's asking them later on in verse 4 and following that people are going to be judged according to these things. So here's the conundrum. If someone tries to advocate, John 2 is trying to prove alcoholic beverage is okay, you've got to show how Christ can violate his own law by already intoxicating people that apparently are already intoxicated, if that is your viewpoint, by saying that Jesus turned water into wine and it was alcoholic. Well, you're going to have a hard time proving that, let alone you have a God who's violating his own law, therefore he's no longer God, therefore you can't be a Christian because Christianity is a dead faith with a God who sins and violates his own law. It creates problems if we try to make that fit. Philip and then Jackie.
Every time this topic comes up, not just here anywhere that it's discussed, it brought up that, well, it was non-alcoholic. Well, if it was all non-alcoholic wine, would it say what it says, not to be taken of much wine or not to be taken of any wine? Why would it say, well, as long as you take of the wine that we talked about in so-and-so passage, that was non-alcoholic, that's okay, but you can't take the wine we was talking about in this passage because it was alcoholic. Wine is wine.
So when I say children, which I know is not in relation in and of itself to wine. When I say children, how many am I talking about? No, because someone may ask the question, do you have any children? And someone may respond, I have one child. However, with wine, there have always been two types of wine, alcoholic, non-alcoholic. So I can't necessarily, just from that one word, see if it's alcoholic or not. I have to allow the context to explain that. So wine is wine, but then I need to look closer into what are we advocating here, alcohol or non-alcohol? So if I say that that's not the case and it's always alcoholic, then I've got to go back to the distillery guy who lives in Arkansas, and he says, we serve wine, but it's all non-alcoholic, which presents an issue if I say, well, no, it has to be alcoholic. That's where knowing the difference in those does make a difference. So wine does mean wine, but then I need to look closer to see what's this doing to the effects of the people. Are they staggering? Are they suddenly doing bad things? Then that would imply it's alcoholic wine. If they still have their senses about them and they're still able to go around and have good cognitive ability, then I'm probably looking at something that is not alcoholic. And then we start getting more into a discussion of the processes in the first century of how they would go about doing that. I don't have all the answers for that, nor do I claim to be an expert on those matters. But for me to say that wine only always means alcoholic wine, I'm missing the other half of the story. Wine is good, as Brother David just pointed out. The good wine is always in meaning to that which is the blood of the grape, which would still be wine, but not wine that we think would be wine. We just call it grape juice.
But the point I'm getting at, the way you said it, not to be taken wine. And that, to me, that means all wine.
So is that alcoholic or non-alcoholic?
I don't think that it would be a sin to take a non-alcoholic wine. So, are they talking about non-alcoholic? Are they talking about alcoholic? They're telling us not to do it.
So it would have to fall within the context of the text for me to determine that. And that's going to vary from passage to passage. Jackie. That's true, but God can't violate his own law and then turn around and say, well, what I did was okay, if we already make presumptions on things. Whatever Jesus would do, it would have to follow the rest of the character of his law, which would, one, not be a stumbling block for anyone. He cannot violate that, otherwise he violates his own law. And also looking for the better edification of an individual. How many people who were at this marriage feast, how many of them had already been given over to wine? I don't know. The text doesn't tell me. How many of them had brown eyes? The text doesn't tell me. Of course, that may seem remedial or childish to make that kind of statement, but people are almost going into this text, like you had just said, Mary, missing the whole point of what this is supposed to emphasize. But some people do make it a big deal.
I was just going to say, but to me, it seems to point to this incident we're talking to, the wine, like I said, the wine that they had, I think, was the wine that they used to drink, was alcohol wine that they had. That's exactly what he says, that they bring out the good second. So if there wasn't a difference, then they wouldn't have said anything about it, right? But that leads to the point two. The second point is that you can't be at a party, a drinking party. Well, Jesus was there. So just being there and he's not doing, he's at a celebration that it's served, and he's not partaking, then I think that would be another thing that we talk about revelries and drinking parties and that kind of stuff too.
That's a good point.
I don't think you can say that that first one was not alcohol when you read the verse, the assumption that you're making and saying that will be sense, but the first ones, some.
Yeah, that's if we're taking the perspective of someone trying to prove that this was alcoholic. And there's so many questions to fill in there that someone has to be able to answer all of these in order to prove their point either direction. So there are some complications when trying to eisegete the text rather than exegete the text. But that's a really good point, really good point.
Assume just because somebody drinks a glass of wine that they're drunk, which I kind of you kind of refer to that all the time. So I think it has to be a large amount of 1 or 2% wine, and you probably throw up when you got drunk because it precedes you. So you know, and I think preachers and teachers always say. 10, 20, 30% wine is what they're relating their sermons to. And I know my side of the family, a lot of those grew grapes. It was a common thing to grow grapes. 15 acres of grapes. My uncle Bernard had a big vineyard in Knoxville. And there's a big argument in the Knoxville paper about it. And some of those made wine. I never saw one of my common family. Busy or drunk or anything. Because they may, I don't know, somebody had to drink. But I think we're talking about 2 different animals here. 1 or 2% alcohol. A lot less than not. A lot less than some of this stuff you think.
Question. We do know that I'm using the argument someone trying to prove that all of this is alcoholic beverage. I'm taking their standpoint as if they were discussing that with you. That's not my viewpoint. We do get that, right? Okay. But yes, a lot of preachers will go in and try to say what we have today is what they did back then, that'd be awful to argue that. So if it was heavenly wine, wouldn't it be spiritual, therefore you can't drink it physically? I'm kidding. Yes, I know what you mean. Okay, so this does present some conflicts, at least with advocates for trying to turn this text into something. Lots of things to take into consideration. Did you say their blood sugar would be like out the wall? Oh my. Oh my goodness. Okay, so interesting study. Normally if we go into this, people will go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, talking about abstain from the appearance of all evil. The concept of one even given over, as we talked about even last week, if you do something that a brother, it may be weaker in the faith, it had actually caused them to fall away from the faith based off what you're doing. That's something else to take into consideration. So this text doesn't really answer everything if we try to use one specific argument for this, but it does create conflicts for the person who tries to make arguments trying to advocate for social drinking.
This is not about that part, but this verse I've read this the first 3 or 4 hours, wondered so when his mother asks him, he says it's not my hour. But then he goes ahead and does it. So what do you think? I mean, I just always thought that was interesting. Like, mom actually did something. Like, she's going to stop my hour.
So,
go ahead and okay.
So 2 texts to look at. That statement's mentioned twice, I believe, in John. It might be 3 times, but I'm thinking it's twice. Well, 3 times if you include chapter 2. If you look in chapter 7, beginning in verse 1, this is right before the Feast of Tabernacles, really the Feast of Booths. would be celebrated, and Jesus' brothers turned to him in verse 3. And notice what they would say. This chapter 7, verse 3, they said to Jesus, "Depart from here and go into Judea, that your brother or your disciples also may see the works that you are doing." Jesus didn't make this well known. In fact, at the end of that occasion in John 2, no one knew that Jesus had done this except for the servants and his disciples. Same thing takes place here in John 7. The brethren say, well, if you are God in the flesh, just make it known to everyone. And Jesus would say they would reason in verse 4, "No one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. You desire that all men enter into the kingdom, but you're not making yourself known to everyone. Why is this?" Well, Jesus would say, verse 6, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always." Now notice in John chapter 17. John chapter 17 and verse 1. Jesus spoke these words, lifted up his eyes to heaven, and said, "Father, the hour has come." What hour? The hour that he said, "My time has not yet come." The hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son also may glorify you, as you have given him all authority over all flesh, that he should give eternal life to as many as you have given. And this is eternal life, that they may know the only true God and Jesus Christ whom you sent. I have glorified you on earth. I have finished the work which you have given me to do. And now, O Father, glorify me together with yourself with the glory with which you have had before the world was. If you notice later on, chapter 18, actually it's not in this text. Let's try Luke 22. I'm looking for, after Jesus had prayed in the garden, he turns around and he says, "Now the hour has come." Chapter 22, verse... Nope, that's not it. I'm going to have to look into that. My understanding of that statement is, if Jesus had prematurely revealed himself to everyone and did the works, he would end up being killed before the time that the Father apparently had planned for Christ to die. That's my understanding of that, which goes to show, even Jesus shows us, as Paul does in Galatians 2, verse 2, that there is a time and a place to go about doing stuff. But in view of what the plan was for salvation, I don't know if Jesus needed those 3 years according to the plan of the Father so that there would be a following already built up and a people already prepared to enter the kingdom come Pentecost. Or, well, I think that probably would be it, because if he just opened himself openly to everyone at that point, then you'd have people coming to see the miracles of Jesus rather than hearing about the fame of Jesus professed throughout the land and people going around and talking about Jesus than people come to him. So I think that was more of a safety precaution at first until the Father said, "This is what's going to happen." So I think that's what that statement deals with.
In my opinion, there had to be a reason for the miracle was because they're out of line. So, and there's a reason it's included in the text. It's important to play the other miracles we don't read about.
Yeah, it would say that in 21.
Well,
there were other times he'd heal a blind man. I see you, Jim. I'm sorry. There were times where he'd heal a blind man, and then he would say, "Don't tell anyone what I've done for you." And then he went and told everybody anyways. So I don't... Huh? Yeah, so whether he wanted him to openly do that or if he was still not wanting the Pharisees to come find him, which it could be a safety mechanism too, of... whatever about it, it has to deal with the purpose of John 21, 30 and 31. These things are written that you may believe. So that would be a part of it. Why specifically that? I don't know. Jim?
You know how those blind men are, they can kick them out.
I don't know about that. Oh my.
I can't get my mind wrapped around verse 10. Explain it. The reason I can't, I guess, is, in the beginning, it set forth the good one. And in the last part of the verse, they've kept the good wine, which means, to me, they're saying the first part is good wine, and now, at the end, they put out the good wine, but in the middle, the men have well drunk. Does that well drunk mean if they've drank a lot of wine, or if they drank wine that made them drunk? I can't quite.
Okay.
If they put good wine out, and they put out the good wine at the end, what did they get drunk on?
So
I can't wrap my mind.
So the word itself, that's the definition, if you were to look up just in a Greek dictionary, is what that word would mean. However, the way that the master of the feast is using this, everyone had their full satisfaction based off of this. And really, what this guy is doing is actually plays off of how God had set up the way salvation would work. Everybody always sets out their best to begin with. And then once they run out, then they use the inferior stuff. Well, in view of what God had planned for man, no, the way the word is being used, everybody sets out the absolute best, and when they have their fill of that and it's all gone, then they have to get just whatever's left and just use that to satisfy the guest. However, if I were to take just, this is the problem of using Greek dictionaries and just taking one definition, because there's actually four definitions for this. The way the master of the feast is using this is when they are well satisfied. So the idea of drunkenness or become intoxicated is not a good way of using the word in this text. Unless if I were looking at drunkard in 1 Peter 4:3 with the same word, that's most definitely talking about someone who is intoxicated. So the word can be used multiple ways, but the context is going to let me know what that is. No, not in this instant. I think that's what.
What's like to me what makes sense. So he's saying most of what happens is they bring out the good wine at first, and then so they don't drunk. They bring out the worst. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. The second great one. Yeah, so it would the second great. So what's the second greatest? It would be still the inferior to the first, is what that would be. Now, going back to what Jim was asking, the concept again is just dealing when everybody has their fill of it, not necessarily intoxication. Yeah, so full satisfaction. But going with the plan of God, the concept how people normally put out their best first and then the weak second, that actually plays with how salvation in view of the law of Moses and the law of Christ works. You can compare this text with 2 Corinthians chapter 3, which talks about that which was glorious and that which is rather glorious. Is talking about the concept that the things that God has in store for those who love Him, this life has many blessings, but just wait till you see the good portion waiting. God didn't give you the best first. The best is yet to come. So there's also a secondary use of this text, which goes to the full use of the book of John. There's so many different ways. The miracles actually reflect the way that God's laid out salvation. And I think that's the concept as well in a secondary sense.
The first one was the best one.
He had, yes, yes.
So, because they were going, as custom would be, they served the best first. And this was the best first. But they thought it was the worst because they got Jesus, really good wine.
Mm-hmm. That's what it is.
They didn't understand it. But I guess it's a miracle. Not all that.
That's it. That's it. So it would have to come from the same source for me to say that what was used in 1500 BC as opposed to 1st century BC. We're looking under Roman culture, so you have a lot of advancements in agriculture and farming. So whatever methods they had learned during that 1500 years, it would be a slightly different product. However, the word would still be the same. That could be an umbrella term for intoxicating, not intoxicating, the grape juice itself, the product of the grape, or even at times the skin of the grape can be called wine at times. So it would be the same source, the exact same product. I don't think so. 2,000-year-old wine wouldn't taste the same as 0 day.
One wine, to me, that's right. There's one wine. It depends on when you drink it.
Yeah, that's
I
true.
mean, it's just one, but it depends on when you drink it, what it's going to be.
Yeah, that would.
If you, it's all made in the same way. It just depends on when you drink it. After it gets fermented, you know, it's alcoholic, but it's still wine.
Yes.
You know, I think that's the way I look at it. I don't see it as they can wine this way and make wine the other way. They make wine.
Yeah, it would be the same process. Time would determine what kind. Exactly right. Exactly right. Genesis 9. No, that's Lot. that was Ham and Noah. Well, he didn't cover his nakedness. Yeah. I'd say so, which there might be a chance that it stayed on the ark that whole time, which I'd say it wasn't human at all on the ark. Oh my. Oh my. Okay, so here's what we'll do. We need to get back to 1 Corinthians. We will come back to the last two questions. Really, I don't want to have another Q&A night this month because we've already taken 2 of the classes for this month. But on the last Wednesday, we will cover these briefly. The last 2, how the judgment day will occur and whether or not God changes his mind. I would suggest for all of us, if we were to read Robert Patton's Bible Wines, he does have some very good research with that. In fact, he doesn't just take the biblical text alone, even though he does a really good job on that, but he also goes into ancient texts that show how vineyard makers in that time would have different ways of processing the wine, which if we're talking about the way Romans made wine and the way Grecians made wine and the location it would be made, there's going to be so many differing variables. But it would be of interest to read those so that we're more well studied on that as opposed to the common man who would take certain key texts and say, well, these are all my proof texts to advocate for the habit that I have, when that may not be the way that it's supposed to be used. So Robert Patton, you can get that free on International College of the Bible. They have a PDF of that book. Or if you want a printed version of that book, let me know. I have access to a ton of them. They're free. They don't cost anything. But I would encourage us reading that. It's definitely a very good resource. Outside of that, we're out of time. Thank you for your time and attention. And we will be back here in just a few minutes. Thank you.